Imagine a world where mental illness was seen as a tangible thing, a physical defect in the very fabric of the brain. Imagine a world where the solution was not therapy or medication, but surgery. Not precise, life-saving surgery, but a brutal, often blind, invasion of the human mind. This is the story of the lobotomy, a medical procedure so radical, so ethically dubious, that it's almost unbelievable it happened at all. Yet for decades, it was celebrated as a miracle cure, a way to tame the untreatable. Prepare to enter an era of medical history where the line between healing and horrific violation became terrifyingly blurred, where thousands of lives were irrevocably altered with the swing of a hammer and the thrust of an ice pick. Before the ice pick, there was the asylum. To understand how a procedure as barbaric as the lobotomy could ever be considered progress, we must first step into the world it was born from, the desperate, hopeless world of the early 20th century mental institution. These were not places of healing. They were human warehouses, vast, Gothic structures built on the outskirts of society, designed not to treat the mentally ill, but to hide them from public view. Imagine the sounds that echoed through these long, sterile corridors, the distant, mournful wails of a patient lost in their own private hell, the sudden shriek of terror, the rhythmic clanking of chains, and the jangling of a warden's keys. The air was thick with the smell of disinfectant, sweat, and a profound, institutional sadness. Overcrowding was the norm. Hundreds, sometimes thousands, of individuals were crammed into spaces designed for a fraction of that number. They were the forgotten, the unfit people, suffering from conditions we now know as schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, severe depression, and even postpartum depression, all lumped together under the single, damning label of lunatic. The treatments offered within these walls were a catalogue of medical horrors, born from a primitive understanding of the brain. Doctors, desperate for any method to control their agitated and suffering patients, resorted to what can only be described as medical torture. Hydrotherapy involved binding patients in freezing cold wet sheets for hours, or blasting them with high-pressure hoses of ice water. The shock intended to jolt them out of their psychosis. Patients were subjected to insulin coma therapy, where massive overdoses of insulin were administered to induce a diabetic coma, sometimes for weeks on end. The risk of death was high, and the benefits were questionable at best. The most infamous of these was electroshock therapy. In its early, unregulated form, it was administered without anesthesia. A massive jolt of electricity sent through the brain, causing a violent, bone-breaking seizure. The goal was to reset the malfunctioning mind, like shaking a machine to get it working again. For the families who had made the agonizing decision to commit a loved one, these were the brutal realities they had to accept. They were told these were the only options, the cutting edge of medical science. Families were caught in an impossible trap. The stigma of having a mentally ill relative was immense. It was seen as a sign of bad blood, a family curse. Desperate to manage a loved one they could no longer care for at home, they turned to these institutions as a last resort, often signing away their rights, and handing their family member over to a system from which there was often no return. This was the world that was crying out for a miracle. The asylums were overflowing, the states that funded them were going bankrupt, and the doctors who ran them were at their wits' end. They needed a solution, not a slow, compassionate one, but a fast, simple, and permanent one. They needed a cure that could be performed quickly, cheaply, and on a mass scale. They needed a way to quiet the wards, to empty the beds, to make the problem of the mentally ill simply go away. The medical community was primed for a radical answer. They were ready to believe in anything that promised a solution, and in 1935, from a neurologist in Portugal, that promise would finally arrive. A promise of a new kind of surgery, a psychosurgery, that could sever the connections in the brain and, supposedly, sever a person from their madness. The age of despair was about to give way to the age of the lobotomy. The call for a miracle, echoing from the desperate halls of the world's asylums, was answered in 1935. The answer came not from a wild-eyed revolutionary, but from a respected and ambitious Portuguese neurologist named Egas Manes. Manes was a man of science, a prominent figure in the medical community, but he was also haunted by the profound helplessness he felt when faced with severely mentally ill patients. He, like many of his peers, believed that the key to unlocking the mind's secrets lay within the physical brain itself. His theory was born from a simple, yet dangerously flawed observation. He noted that patients suffering from conditions like obsessive-compulsive disorder or severe anxiety seemed to be trapped in rigid, repetitive thought patterns. Their minds were like a record player with the needle stuck in a single, endlessly repeating groove. He theorized that these fixed circuits of thought resided in the frontal lobes, the part of the brain responsible for personality, emotion, and higher reasoning. If he could just sever these circuits, he reasoned, he could break the loop. He could liberate the patient from their mental prison. The inspiration for how to do this came from a 1935 neurological conference in London. There, Muniz witnessed a presentation by a fellow scientist who had performed experiments on 2 chimpanzees. One of the chimps, named Becky, was prone to violent, angry outbursts when she made mistakes during problem-solving tasks. After a procedure that removed her frontal lobes, Becky became completely placid. She no longer grew agitated. She simply sat, calm and passive, a shadow of her former, fiery self. Where others saw a tragedy, a spirit broken by surgery, Igor Manes saw a solution. He saw a path forward. He returned to Lisbon with a revolutionary, terrifying idea. If removing the frontal lobes could calm a chimpanzee, perhaps simply severing the connections within the frontal lobes could cure a human. He called his new procedure the Lobotomy. The method was brutal and imprecise. In his first operations, he would drill 2 holes into the patient's skull, on either side of their forehead. He would then insert a thin, sharp instrument called a leucotome into the brain. The leucotome had a retractable wire loop at its end. Once inside the frontal lobe, Muniz would extend the wire and rotate the instrument, blindly severing the white matter and, in his view, the fixed circuits of madness. His first patients were individuals taken from the asylums, people with no other hope, suffering from severe depression, anxiety, and schizophrenia. The results, in Muniz's eyes, were a stunning success. The patients were no longer agitated. Their violent outbursts ceased. They were calm, placid, and easier for the asylum staff to manage. What Manes and his supporters celebrated as a calming effect, however, was often described by others as a profound loss of personality. The patients became apathetic, emotionally blunted, and childlike. Their inner fire had been extinguished, replaced by a vacant, passive emptiness. But in an age of desperation, a quiet patient was seen as a cured patient. News of Muniz's miracle spread like wildfire through the international medical community. Here at last was the solution they had been searching for. A quick, surgical fix for the most complex ailments of the human mind. The nuance of the personality changes was brushed aside in the wave of enthusiasm. The procedure was hailed as a revolutionary breakthrough, and in 1949, in what is now considered one of the most controversial decisions in medical history, Dr. Igor Manes was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine for his invention of the Lobotomy. The Nobel Prize cemented the lobotomy's place as a legitimate, celebrated, and even heroic medical procedure. It gave a seal of approval to what was, in essence, a brutal and blind assault on the human brain. The stage was now set for the procedure to not just be an experimental treatment, but a mainstream solution, ready to be adopted and perfected by an ambitious American doctor who would turn Manes' already brutal surgery into a terrifyingly efficient assembly line nightmare. The Nobel Prize gave the lobotomy an air of unimpeachable scientific legitimacy. It was no longer a controversial experiment. It was a celebrated, award-winning cure. And this international acclaim caught the attention of an ambitious American neurologist and psychiatrist who would become the procedure's most fervent and infamous champion, Dr. Walter Freeman. Freeman was not just a doctor, he was a showman, a crusader, an evangelist. He worked in the overcrowded, desperate asylums of the United States and saw in Manes' leucotomy the miracle he had been waiting for. But Freeman found Manes' method, which required drilling holes into the skull in a sterile operating room, to be too slow, too complicated, and too expensive for the scale of the problem he wanted to solve. He envisioned a future where the lobotomy was not a rare last resort neurosurgery, but a simple, mainstream procedure, accessible to everyone. He wanted to create an assembly line for the mind. To do this, he needed a new technique, a faster, simpler, more direct route to the frontal lobes. His inspiration came from a simple observation of human anatomy. He knew that the bone separating the eye socket from the frontal lobes was incredibly thin, a fragile wall of bone that could be easily punctured. His horrifyingly simple idea was to bypass the thick frontal skull entirely and go through the eye. The legend, which is based in truth, is that Freeman perfected his new method in his own kitchen using a grapefruit and an actual ice pick. He would tap the ice pick through the top of the grapefruit into the soft flesh, then sweep it back and forth, mimicking the severing of brain fibers. He had found his method. He called it the transorbital lobotomy. The world would come to know it by its more infamous name, the ice pick lobotomy. The procedure itself was a masterpiece of brutal efficiency. The patient, often without their full consent, would be rendered unconscious, not with anesthesia, but with a powerful jolt of electroshock therapy. As they lay seizing on the table, Freeman would lift one of their eyelids. He would take his new, specially designed instrument, a long, sharp steel pick called an orbitoclast, and place its tip under the eyelid, into the corner of the eye socket. Then, he would take a surgical mallet, and with a few sharp, practiced taps, he would drive the instrument through the thin layer of bone and into the prefrontal cortex of the brain. The sound, a dull, hollow crack, was often audible in the room. Once the instrument was approximately 2 inches into the brain, Freeman would then aggressively pivot the handle back and forth, a 15-degree sweep, severing the delicate neural connections that governed personality, emotion, and thought. He would then withdraw the instrument, lift the other eyelid, and repeat the process on the other side of the brain. The entire procedure took less than 10 minutes. Armed with this terrifyingly simple technique, Walter Freeman became a missionary of psychosurgery. He developed a special van, which he nicknamed the Lobotomobile, and traveled across the United States from one desperate, overcrowded asylum to another. He was a traveling surgeon, performing dozens of lobotomies a day, sometimes not even in an operating room, but in patient wards or small repurposed closets. He became a celebrity, a medical messiah promising to empty the asylums and cure the incurable. The press celebrated his work, publishing stories of once violent patients now rendered as calm and manageable as children. What Freeman had done was a terrifying leap. He had taken a complex neurosurgery, a procedure that, for all its flaws, was still in the realm of specialized medicine, and had reduced it to a 10-minute outpatient procedure that could be performed with an instrument modeled on a kitchen tool. The promise of a cure was now accessible to all, and the stage was set for a medical tragedy of an unimaginable scale, one that would unfold in asylums and hospitals across America for the next 2 decades. With a procedure as fast and portable as the ice pick lobotomy, Dr. Walter Freeman had unleashed a medical revolution. But the revolution had a dark and devastating secret. Its victims, the lobotomy, which was initially proposed as a desperate last-resort treatment for the most severely and violently insane, quickly became a terrifyingly common solution for a shockingly wide range of human behaviors. The floodgates opened. The procedure was performed on schizophrenics and those with severe depression. Yes, but the definition of mental illness began to stretch to an alarming degree. It was used on veterans suffering from what we now call PTSD. It was used on anxious housewives, on people with obsessive-compulsive disorder, on rebellious teenagers, and on homosexuals, who were considered mentally deviant at the time. The lobotomy became a crude weapon against any behavior that deviated from the social norms of the 1940s and 50s. It was a surgical tool for enforcing conformity. To truly understand the horror, we must look past the statistics and into the lives that were irrevocably broken. The most famous and tragic of these is the story of Rosemary Kennedy. She was the 3rd child of the powerful Kennedy dynasty, the sister of future President John F. Kennedy. Rosemary was not insane. She was born with developmental disabilities that left her with a lower-than-average IQ. As she grew into a young woman, she was described as beautiful and charming, but also prone to mood swings and a rebellious streak that worried her ambitious, image-conscious father, Joseph Kennedy. He feared that a public outburst or a potential pregnancy could cause a scandal that would derail his son's political careers. In his eyes, his daughter's difficult personality was not a challenge to be managed with compassion, but a problem to be solved permanently. In 1941, at the age of 23, Rosemary Kennedy was taken by her father to be lobotomized by Dr. Walter Freeman. The procedure was a catastrophe. The vibrant, if troubled, young woman was reduced to an infantile state. She lost the ability to speak coherently, to control her movements, to walk. The cure had erased her. In the aftermath, the Kennedy family hid her away from the world, placing her in a private institution, where she remained for the rest of her life. Her existence, a closely guarded secret, a ghost in the celebrated American family. Rosemary's story is horrifying, but it was not unique. Consider Howard Dully. In 1960, he was a rambunctious 12-year-old boy. His stepmother found him defiant and difficult. She took him to see Dr. Freeman. Freeman met with the boy for only a few minutes before diagnosing him and recommending a lobotomy. Dully was awake for the procedure. He remembered the feeling of the ice pick entering his brain. The surgery didn't cure him. It left him in a fog, emotionally detached. a stranger in his own life. He spent the next 40 years of his life trying to understand what had been done to him. A child sacrificed on the altar of a parent's convenience and a doctor's hubris. These stories were repeated thousands of times, in different forms, across the country. What Freeman and other proponents hailed as a success was a patient who was now quiet, docile, and easy to manage. But the families and asylum nurses often told a different story. They spoke of a profound loss, of the spark or the soul being extinguished. Patients lost their ability to feel deep emotion, to plan for the future, to form meaningful relationships. They became apathetic ghosts, trapped in the prison of a now-come mind. The procedure didn't cure the underlying illness. It often just erased the person who was suffering from it. By the mid-1950s, an estimated 50,000 lobotomies had been performed in the United States alone. Walter Freeman himself had personally performed over 3,400 of them, crisscrossing the country in his lab. The mortality rate was significant, with many patients dying from brain hemorrhages, but the rate of severe life-altering complications was far higher. For every patient who showed some semblance of improvement, there were countless others left permanently disabled, their lives shattered. The miracle cure that had been celebrated with a Nobel Prize had created an army of silent, broken ghosts, a testament to a time when medicine, in its desperate search for a simple solution, had lost its way in the darkest corridors of the human mind. For nearly 2 decades, the ice-pick lobotomy cut a brutal path through the landscape of American psychiatry. But even at the height of Dr. Walter Freeman's fame, as he traveled the country in his lobotomobile, the seeds of doubt were beginning to sprout within the medical community. A growing number of neurologists and surgeons were horrified by the crude, imprecise nature of the transorbital lobotomy. They saw it not as a refined surgical technique, but as a violent, reckless assault on the most complex organ in the known universe. They argued that Freeman, a man who was not a surgeon, was blindly scrambling brain tissue with no real understanding of the long-term consequences. The debate raged in medical journals and behind the closed doors of hospital boardrooms. The miracle cure was starting to look more like a medical crime, but the true death knell of the lobotomy came not from an ethical debate, but from a scientific breakthrough. In the early 1950s, a new discovery was made in a French laboratory, a medication called chlorpromazine, which would be marketed in the United States under the brand name Thorazine. It was the world's first effective antipsychotic drug. For the first time in history, the most severe symptoms of psychosis, the hallucinations, the delusions, the agitation, could be managed chemically. The effect was revolutionary. Patients who had been considered hopelessly insane, locked away in asylums for years, suddenly became calm, lucid, and able to engage with the world again. It was a true medical miracle, and it offered a profound contrast to the brutal violence of the lobotomy. Where Freeman's cure required a hammer and an ice pick, this new cure came in the quiet, simple form of a pill. Thorazine and the wave of antipsychotic medications that followed did what the lobotomy never could. They began to empty the asylums. It was the dawn of a new era in psychiatry, one focused on pharmacology and therapy rather than invasive surgery. The lobotomy, once seen as the only hope, was suddenly rendered obsolete, a relic of a primitive and brutal past. As the scientific tide turned, so did public perception. The media, which had once celebrated Dr. Freeman as a pioneering hero, now began to tell a different story. Whistleblowers and horrified nurses began to speak out. Families of lobotomy victims, once silent in their shame, began to share their tragic experiences. Stories of patients left emotionally vacant, permanently disabled, or dead from the procedure began to replace the earlier, sanitized tales of success. The image of the brilliant doctor curing madness was replaced by the image of a reckless showman leaving a trail of broken minds in his wake. Dr. Walter Freeman found himself a pariah in the medical community he had once dominated. Hospitals stripped him of his surgical privileges. His colleagues shunned him, yet he remained a true believer, unable to accept that his life's work, his miracle cure, was now seen as a grotesque medical horror. He continued to perform a small number of lobotomies in his private office, a man clinging to a discredited past. His crusade came to a grim and fitting end in 1967. During his last known transorbital lobotomy, he severed a blood vessel in the patient's brain, and she died from a massive hemorrhage. This final fatal failure effectively ended the age of the ice pick in America. The legacy of the lobotomy is a dark and complex one. It stands as a terrifying cautionary tale about medical hubris and the profound dangers of seeking simple solutions for complex human problems. It is the story of tens of thousands of lives that were not saved, but irrevocably altered or destroyed. And it is a story that carries a permanent, institutional stain. The Nobel Prize awarded to August Menaez for his invention has never been revoked. The age of the ice pick is over. But the questions it raised still haunt us. How could so many brilliant people, driven by a desire to heal, be so catastrophically wrong? What does this dark chapter tell us about our own society's relentless search for quick fixes? The lobotomy is gone, but the anatomy of the dread, it represents the fear of the unknown mind, and the terrifying lengths we will go to control it remains a timeless and essential lesson. The age of the ice pick is over. The lobotomable no longer roams the highways, and the asylums that housed these horrors have largely been closed. Their empty, decaying halls are silent testament to a dark chapter in medical history. It's easy for us, in our modern age of advanced pharmacology and nuanced understanding of mental health, to look back at the lobotomy with a sense of detached horror. It feels like a relic from a primitive, unenlightened time, a brutal practice that could never happen today. But is that really true? The story of the lobotomy is not just a history lesson, it is a terrifying mirror. It reflects a timeless and deeply human danger, our relentless, desperate search for simple solutions to complex human suffering. The same forces that allowed the lobotomy to flourish are still very much alive today. The unseen inquisitor has simply changed its form. The overflowing asylums have been replaced by a society grappling with an epidemic of anxiety, depression, and loneliness. The fear and stigma surrounding mental illness, while reduced, still linger in the shadows of our communities, and the desperate call for a miracle cure is louder than ever. The ice pick is gone, but the underlying mindset that created it persists. We see its echo in the rush to prescribe a pill for every psychological ailment, sometimes without the necessary accompaniment of therapy and deep, compassionate understanding. We see it in the billion-dollar self-help industry that often sells simplistic one-size-fits-all formulas for happiness. We see it in our hustle culture, which tells us that the cure for burnout is not rest, but a new productivity app. The fundamental flaw of the lobotomy was that it treated the patient as a broken machine. It saw a complex human being with a lifetime of experiences, thoughts, and emotions, and reduced them to a set of faulty circuits that needed to be cut. It tried to cure the soul by damaging the brain. This is the ultimate lesson of the lobotomy. It teaches us that true healing is not about silencing the symptoms, it is about understanding the suffering. It is a chilling reminder that progress without empathy is not progress at all. It is simply a more sophisticated form of barbarism. It warns us to be wary of any solution, medical or otherwise, that promises a simple fix for the deep, intricate, and often painful complexities of what it means to be human. So, here is our call to action. It is a call for reflection. Look at the world around you, and at your own life. Where do you see the echo of the ice pick today? Where do you see a complex human problem being offered a dangerously simple cure? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's talk about the importance of empathy, patience, and true understanding in a world that is always searching for a quick fix. By remembering the ghosts of the lobotomy, we can ensure that we never again try to cure a soul by breaking the mind.